Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Eco Mindset Podcast. This week, we're following up on our series about anti-Chinese racism in Canada and in Canadian politics. I sat down with William Dere, a left-wing Chinese-Canadian activist who's been active in Montreal, Quebec for really decades now. We got a chance to talk a bit about the context, the historical context of some of the anti-Chinese racism that we're seeing nowadays in Canadian politics. We got to talk specifically about the work that he did in the 2000s, calling for redress for the Chinese head tax, and ultimately the apology that the Chinese community received from Stephen Harper shortly after he was sworn into office in 2006. I think that it's an interesting discussion that a lot of people can learn from about the origins of some of this anti-Chinese racism and what can be done to combat it. Welcome to the Eco Mindset. At a time when the climate is crumbling, inequality is on the rise, and our leaders are beating the drums of war, let's talk about the issues, the solutions, and the power dynamics that got us here. All over the world, people are getting involved. The resistance is growing, and progress is within reach. Join us to discover, to debate, and to learn about the ongoing struggle for the environment, for peace, and for social justice in Quebec, Canada, and around the world. My name is Alex Tyrrell, and I'm your host for this podcast, The Eco Mindset. Welcome to the Eco Mindset Podcast. Today we have William Dere with us. He's somebody who's been very active in Quebec and Canada, standing up for the rights of the Chinese community, and has been involved in different left-wing movements in Quebec and Canada over the years. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today, William, to discuss some of the issues that are happening in terms of anti-Chinese racism in Quebec and Canadian politics. As you know, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Senator Wu about Bill C-70, a bill that could really have some very detrimental effects on the democratic rights of Chinese Canadian citizens. You were somebody that was very involved in the campaign for redress back in the early 2000s. And I think, a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with what took place at the time, but you were involved in a campaign that forced the Canadian government to apologize for the Canadian head tax and even provide some compensation. I was wondering, from your point of view, what has changed since that campaign in the 2000s? What are the areas of progress that have been made, and what are some of the setbacks?
Well, thank you, Alex, for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I guess that's a basic issue that we need to address is historically how the Canadian government has treated or had treated or still treating Chinese immigrants, Chinese Canadians, and entirely the Chinese diaspora. I described very well in detail. I documented in detail our campaign, our 22-year campaign for redress in my book, Being in Canada. Just a bit of shameless self-promotion. I just want to show the cover of it. Okay. So if anybody's interested, it's published by Douglas and McIntyre. Okay, so what's happening today is it's a continuity of what happened with Chinese immigrants about 150 years ago, when Chinese workers came as part of the nation building effort to help construct the railway across Canada, and we were greeted by hostility. We were greeted by government legislation. There was racist legislation, which lasted 62 years of Canada's history in the form of the head tax, and finally the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all Chinese immigration into Canada for 24 years. So then, as now, I think Canada's attitude towards China has a big impact on how Chinese Canadians and Chinese people in general are being treated in Western society or Canadian society, because back in those days, China was a very poor country, uh, uh, not much power, pretty much powerless. And today, China has become more powerful. In fact, it's challenging the West in global economics and so on. And so China's become so-called threat to Canadian democracy and Canadian way of life. And so because of that, it does have an impact on Chinese Canadians who are living here in Canada. And so this is an ongoing thing that we have to deal with. And so what are the lessons? How has the society evolved? I think Canadian society, as much as the Chinese Canadian society, need to understand the significance of these two racist laws, the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and what that means, what they mean for the development of Canadian history and Canadian society.
Right. And so obviously Canada has, as with Indigenous people and many different people who came here, has a history of racism, right? Banning, any Chinese people from entering the country for over 20 years and imposing this head tax and benefiting off of, labor from Chinese people to build this railway system. Can you tell us a bit more about the campaign for redress, how you managed to get Stephen Harper to apologize for the Canadian head tax, the Chinese head tax?
Yes, you would not think that Harper would be the one to do it, but he did. Like I said, I got involved with the head tax redress movement back in 1984. And it was the one unifying struggle within the Chinese Canadian community, because all of the Chinese immigrants who came to Canada before the Exclusion Act, they were affected. Their families were affected. All their descendants were all affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in Chinatown, in those days, there was still quite a few survivors, head taxpayers who were still alive. And so we said, I was still young and energetic in those days. So we got, we started to organize these people, and then we started to organize others in the community, because us people may stereotype the community that we're very politically passive, and we don't want to create too much trouble and antagonism with authorities, which was a justified attitude because of the repression that we faced from Canadian authorities throughout the exclusion years. But nevertheless, we were able to get going, and so we dealt with various levels of government. We dealt with various parties, conservatives, NDP, and so on, and they all voiced, concern in terms of that. Yes, this was not just, but we can't go back to the past. We can't redress what was done in the past. Which was a total cop out. So I think 10 years prior to the apology, Jean Chrétien was in power, and he had this policy of no apology, no compensation for the head tax or the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so he just, his Minister of Multiculturalism stood up in Parliament and said, we've finished all discussions with the Chinese Canadian community. And so we were at a total impasse. So we had to start all over again and start reorganizing and getting support from other Canadians.
And why do you think that the Liberals, as much Chrétien as Paul Martin, would take such a hard line against redress?
The funny thing is, this hard line was the ideology of Pierre Trudeau. Even though he had, fond memories of his travels in China, and he was one of the first Western leaders to establish relationship with the People's Republic of China. He had this, I guess, philosophy, and it's part of the philosophy to put down the Quebec nation as well. He instituted this multiculturalism, which is probably the primary reason for having this was to suppress the liberation struggle of the Quebec people. So he says that multiculturalism, everybody has the right to express their views. Everybody has the right to their own culture in Canada, and so on and so forth. And so he's looking at so-called collective rights of the community and none of the individual rights, because what we were fighting for was for individual rights of head taxpayers and their families to be compensated for the 62 years of racial oppression, and also the 24 years of separation of families. And the entire Chinese Canadian community did not develop normally because of these laws, and many dysfunctional families, took place in Chinese Canadian families, and so that was the background as to why the Liberal Party took this kind of attitude. Brian Mulroney, even though he did redress the Japanese-Canadian internment situation, I think he redressed all of the Japanese Canadians who were interned during the Second World War. He also felt he did not redress the Chinese Canadians, even though he showed some sympathy, but he proposed a medallion and a certificate. And so what we said to him was, we already have a certificate. We have the head tax certificate, so we don't need any more certificates from you. And so through this whole process, what I realized is that, and not to get into a conspiracy theory, that the bureaucracy, or what the Americans call the deep state, these are the ones that are controlling the situation behind the scenes, because they did the calculations saying, if we redress the Chinese, this is how much it's going to cost. And then other communities might, pursue redresses, such as the Ukrainians, the Italians, the Germans, whoever, who were interned by the government during the Second World War. And so it would take quite a energetic politician to overcome the bureaucracy, because it's the bureaucracy that keeps the government running, despite whatever government is in place or between governments. And so it continues. And so in the run-up to the 2006 elections, Paul Martin was the prime minister. And if you're old enough to recall, and you're probably not, Alex, is that
I was in high school, but I was following politics.
Okay, well, Paul Martin, was implicated in the so-called sponsorship scandal, and paying off certain corporations and so on and so forth, and so he did a similar deal with a small group of people in the Chinese Canadian community, and so we totally rejected that agreement. And that agreement was that they would offer compensation to the community only, not individuals, but in return, they would not have to apologize.
Oh.
And so we said, no, that's totally unacceptable. And then Harper comes along, and he sees, because by that time, we're able to galvanize the Chinese Canadian community and the media in the Chinese Canadian community. And because Chinese Canadian TV, Chinese language TV was doing this story day after day, week after week, month after month in the run up to the 2006 elections. And so Stephen Harper saw an opportunity to gain some votes in the Chinese Canadian community. Mm-hmm. So he met with leaders in the redress movement. He sent two of his lieutenants, Sean Kenny and Beth Oda, to meet with us. In fact, I met them in Toronto, and they held mass meetings. It's quite surprising. They held mass meetings right across Canada, from Halifax, Montreal, Ottawa, Edmonton, Vancouver. And so we mobilized the community to go and speak. Many of our elderly went up there to speak. And so it was like a talk, bitterness session. We told the ministers how difficult it was separating the families, how difficult it was that we had to repay the $500 head tax. And so it was through that process that we finally got Stephen Harper to agree to an apology and a partial redress. And the partial redress is a funny thing, because all those who were alive when Harper became prime minister on February, I think it was the 6th, 2006, who were still alive, these were the only people that got compensation. All those who had passed away before he became prime minister, they got absolutely nothing. Even their families, their descendants, got nothing. So over 95% of the community were not compensated, but we did get the apology.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that they had limited only to people who were still surviving. You'd think that they would have compensated everybody.
Total compensation package that the government paid out was $15 million. And and the head tax collected from 81,000 Chinese immigrants came to $23 million in face value, going back to 1900s. And so the government shows that they can profit from racism. And our case is a case in point.
Right. That's a very good point. And this apology, would you consider it to be highly symbolic? Like, I know that Harper apologized to Indigenous people for the residential school situation, but then his policies did not really change that much. Would you say that there was concrete progress that was made, or was the apology highly symbolic?
It was more symbolic than anything else. I was in the visitors gallery when Harper stood up in Parliament. He even spoke a few words of Cantonese. So it was very symbolic, but it was quite moving as well for about 300 Chinese Canadians sitting there. I was there, as I wrote in my book, that I was there to accept the apology from my father and my mother. So it was quite significant for me. But having said that, nothing much has come out of it. I mean, it's just the same situation that happens in Chinatowns throughout Canada from day to day. Encroachment of urban development, gentrification, and so on. Same kind of situation that's been happening to the Chinatown in Montreal.
Yeah. And, in more recent times, we've had a lot of, should I say, hysteria about Chinese influence in Canadian politics. And it's led to the adoption of this bill C-70, which talks about foreign agents registry. I know that a lot of people in the Chinese community feel that this bill unfairly targets them. What's your perspective on Bill C-70?
Okay, I think I saw your interview with Senator Wu, and I think he did a very good job in explaining C-70. C-70 originated, I guess, in the Chinese interference hysteria witch hunt about 2 years ago. And now it has evolved into a wider McCarthyite repressive weapon, a piece of legislation to suppress dissent. I mean, right now it's not just addressing the Chinese Canadians or Chinese who have sympathy with People's China, but it's also could be used to suppress support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. It could be used to suppress anybody who may sympathize with Russia in this, fight against the NATO encroachment on their territory. So if you're not registered to express these views or to participate in these activities, you may be criminalized. But we don't know yet. We don't know what the application of C-70 is going to be like. And so that's the next, I guess that's the next process.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the deep state before. One thing that comes to mind for me is all of these, leaks and the statements being made by the RCMP and by CSIS about Chinese interference. I was reading the other day in Radio Canada a report that said that basically China is trying to control our elections, that they're hacking all the computer systems, that they're doing all these things, but it's not substantiated by any kind of proof, and it has not been proven in the court of law. Even in Quebec here, where they took, the two Chinese community centers in the province, and the RCMP just made the statement that they are police stations for the Chinese Communist Party without, providing any kind of proof, without any kind of arrests, and without any kind of trial or anything like that. What do you think about the way that the Canadian intelligence services and federal police have been vilifying the Chinese community?
This is not new. Okay. In my experience, it goes back to 1997 or even before that. I don't know if you're aware of this. In 1997, the RCMP and CSIS put together a report called Project Sidewinder, and in their analysis, so-called analysis, is that the Chinese diaspora, businesses and so on, is in league with the Hong Kong triad, the Hong Kong mafia, and they serve the Chinese security apparatus to infiltrate into Canadian affairs and to influence Canadian politicians. And this was back in 1997. But the government watchdog concluded that there was no substance to this Sidewinder report. And so it was dismissed at that time. But that mindset that these people have, the Canadian establishment has, is still there. And so that mindset is coming to the fore. And I think in Justin Trudeau's weakened state, they're coming out, and they're coming out with a lot of force, supported by their scribes in the media. Anything they leak out to the media eats it up and produces it as gospel truth. The opposition parties are latching onto it, and so it's there. But perhaps I should give you a little bit of context as to when and how this whole process came about, because in the early 2000s, Canada and China had very good relations in economic, cultural, social matters, and it was mutually beneficial. I think Canadian society benefited with these relationships with China, and the Chinese society benefited with these relationships with Canada. That was in the early 2000s. And then, I guess, after the 2008 meltdown of financial capital, the whole Western world was in a state of chaos, financial chaos. The Chinese actually try to help bail them out by keeping their currency pretty much stable, even at their own cost. And the Chinese, since they were not involved, or they were not integrated into the Western capitalist system, survived that, came out of that financial crisis in very good shape. And so the Chinese economy started developing in double-digit increases. And so this came up, I guess, happening up to, continued to happen up to about 2015. And then the U.S. developed this whole pivot to Asia and containment of China policy. Because the justification was that, we invested so much money into China to help them develop the economy and so on and so forth, as if they're the ones that produce all these manufacturing goods that the Chinese workers produce. And at the same time, they refused to overthrow their own government. They still continue to maintain a socialist system. And so that's totally unacceptable to us. And in 2018 was a series of meetings of the Five Eyes network. Five Eyes are the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American countries of U.S., Britain, Canada, Great Britain, and not Great Britain, but New Zealand and Australia. Mm-hmm. So these are the Five Eyes. So they had a whole series of meetings as to what to do. And the first project was to suppress Huawei, because and they said under the guise of security, danger of national security, whereas they were afraid of the Huawei technology and development of the 5G system by Huawei.
And now we're afraid of solar panels and electric vehicles manufactured in China as well.
Yes, well, that's something that we'll get into after a couple of years of the anti-Huawei thing, because I don't know if you remember, Huawei used to sponsor Hockey Night in Canada.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes, they used to sponsor every week. They would be on this, all these commentators and so on during intermission. And you would have Huawei signs in the background, and their podium, Huawei here. So and Huawei invests a lot in employing Canadians. They had an R&D center in Ottawa to help Canadians develop. So they, I think they employ hundreds of Canadian engineers and technicians. And they still have some offices in Lachlan, Ontario, to help market and sell Huawei in Canada. But nevertheless, the Canadian government banned Huawei for no other reason than saying that Huawei is a national security threat. And then December of 2018, of course, they arrested the CFO of Huawei and detained her for 3 years. And so ever since 2018, there's a huge offensive against Chinese so-called influence, Chinese interference, and anything you can think of. The Chinese is responsible for anything bad that you can think of. The Chinese is responsible for them.
Yeah, it makes me think about that time when they told us that the Chinese were sending spy balloons over North America, and it turned out to be a weather balloon that had gone off course, and there was all this big deal made about it by Joe Biden and all that, but then even the U.S. government had to admit afterwards that there was no spy equipment on board. Yes. But the amount of vilification that went into that was just astounding.
Well, they spend close to $1 million to shoot down on these balloons. And all these balloons would have cost, tens of thousands to make. So, but they got $1 million worth of propaganda publicity against the Chinese. And so the only thing people think about now is that the Chinese sent spy balloons over North America.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of people that want to make Canadians afraid of China.
Well, that's another point I was going to make, is that it's the whole question of the Yellow Peril. Okay, the Yellow Peril is a psychology and ideology first developed in Europe the British drug lords used the specter of the Yellow Peril to justify their two opium wars, to force a addictive drug on the Chinese people. They occupy Hong Kong for 150 years. They led the Eight Nation Alliance to sack Peking or Beijing, as we call it today. And by the way, the Eight Nation Alliance is very similar to the countries of the G7. And so it shows that the G7 is nothing new. It goes back into imperial days of Kaiser Wilhelm, in Germany. So so the Yellow Peril psychology allow the Canadian government to pass racist legislation like the head tax and the Chinese exclusion, because there was a fear of Chinese people taking over the world at that time. And well, it wasn't exactly taking over the world, but there was a fear of the Chinese people contaminating the world, because the Chinese were dirty heathens and full of disease. They were the sick man of Asia. And so today, I think we have Yellow Peril 2.0. It's a modern version of the Yellow Peril, and so the specter of the Yellow Peril is always there. And I guess I should give you the dictionary definition of Yellow Peril. And they're all pretty much the same. The definition of Yellow Peril is the power or the alleged power of Asiatic peoples, especially the Chinese, to threaten or destroy white supremacy or Western hegemony, which is actually quite right on. And that's why there's this whole fear of the Yellow Peril, because they feel that their society, their civilization, the white civilization, Western civilization, is being threatened by the Chinese or by the Asians. And I think this is the psychological thing behind this anti-Chinese hysteria, apart from the ideological aspect of socialism versus capitalism.
Yeah. And that brings me to an issue that I want to explore about what's happening in Taiwan. I asked this question to Senator Wu as well. Like, every so often when you watch CBC News, they have CBC journalists on boats or on aircraft flying down or navigating down the Taiwan Strait and essentially challenging Chinese airspace and sea space. But it's presented to the Canadian public as, oh, look, here we are in international waters, and these, big bad Chinese aircraft are coming and challenging us, or, we're navigating Canadian warships off the Taiwan Strait, and now there's a Chinese boat that's coming really close to us. They make it sound like in these circumstances that China is sort of like an aggressor, or that, you'd think the way that they're talking about it as if China was challenging Canadian airspace, but it's not the case. Why is Canada and Canadian journalists from CBC on the other side of the world trying to challenge these borders and then, reporting it back to us as if it's an act of Chinese aggression?
Okay, what's happening there is written into Canada's Indo-Pacific policy. And in that policy, I think they set aside, I don't have the exact figure, I guess 50 million to 500 million. That's a big difference. But either 50 million or $500 million for a naval patrol in the Indo-Pacific. And so part of their so-called naval patrol is to be allowed to sail through the Taiwan Strait under the guise of freedom of navigation. Okay? But if you look at freedom of navigation, it's in the open seas. The Taiwan Strait is not open seas. uh, if you apply the economic zone of either China or of Taiwan, it overlaps the Strait of Taiwan Strait. I think you have 200 miles off your coast as part of your economic zone. And so the widest part of Taiwan, of the Taiwan Strait, I think you can problems. And so it's within, Chinese territorial waters or Taiwan territorial waters, and Taiwan being, a province of China, according to the Chinese. But Canada does not recognize that, even though Pierre Trudeau in 1970 developed economic relations with the People's Republic of China, saying that Taiwan is an integral part of China. So Canada itself is violating its own diplomatic policies, and that's a question you should put to Melanie Joly, although she is probably ignorant of this kind of history. So Canada, as a junior partner of the U.S., does these things, and most of the time it does these things with the U.S. I think it's a joint sailing most of the time with a U.S. destroyer and a Canadian warship that sail through the Taiwan Strait. And I think back in August, Canada participated in the Rim of the Pacific War Games, Rim Pack, with Americans as well. And so all of this is in provocation of China. So what can I say? So if the Chinese reacts defensively to American or Canadian warships and Canadian aircrafts flying through the Taiwan Strait off the coast of China, I think the Chinese have a right to be concerned.
Yeah. And I want to talk about also the sort of isolation of China. Like we've seen a lot of academic cooperation be targeted by the sort of new wave of anti-Chinese hysteria, and I think that's very unfortunate, especially when it comes to climate research and that kind of thing. And also, some people might not know this, but I do like to follow space exploration quite a bit. And I know that China was not part of the International Space Station because the U.S. Congress had voted against it. Meanwhile, China now has its own space station that will likely outlast the International Space Station, and with some other countries from the BRICS alliance, is actually planning an international lunar station on the surface of the moon that so far the West and Canada would be excluded from. What do you think about this, exclusion of China from science and academic research and from the space program as well?
Well, the situation of the ISS is quite hilarious. First of all, Canada and the United States are not excluded from the lunar station. In fact, I think the Chinese have issued invitations.
Right. Well, I meant to say that they did not accept the invitation.
That's what. Yeah. But the Chinese have been excluded from the ISS out of, again, national security concerns. But the funniest thing is that Boeing flies them up to the ISS, and then they get stuck there, for over 6 months because Boeing can't fly them back to Earth. Whereas the Chinese have been making routine trips between their space stations and the Earth. And so the Americans are clinging on to their so-called superiority, space superiority, in the face of the facts that they're falling behind. But, I guess that's all I can say. The Chinese feel they have a wider perspective on things, that going to space is a project of humanity. it's not a project of one or two countries. And so, again, that is the Yellow Peril, threatening the unipolar thinking of the Americans and the unipolar thinking of the Canadians, who have attached themselves to the American pole, whereas the Chinese, in their multipolar perspective, have invited BRICS nations, other nations that have capabilities of training astronauts to participate with them.
Yeah. And it seems like we're definitely going towards the emergence of a multipolar world where the United States does not necessarily control the entire planet. Do you think that there's a way to allow this transition to happen without some sort of a global conflict?
As the definition that I just gave you on Yellow Peril, the threat of Asians or Chinese replacing Western hegemony is there. Yes. And I think they feel it. It's a rear guard action that they're fighting. And I have to now getting back to this whole Taiwan thing. When Trudeau Sr. Established relations with Taiwan, there was a rear guard action by the Guomindang, because the Guomindang was quite strong here in Canada. There was even a headquarters here in Montreal at that time.
Can you just describe that group a little bit?
Okay, the Guomindang is the Chinese Nationalist Party, and it was founded by Sun Yat-sen, and then it was headed by Chiang Kai-shek. And the Guomindang forces established the Republic of China. They overthrew the Qing dynasty to establish a republic. And so they established the Republic of China in 1912 under Sun Yat-sen. And then he died, and Chiang Kai-shek took power. Under Sun Yat-sen, the Guomindang found alliance with the Comintern, the Communist International, with the Soviet Union at that time. So their sympathies were towards the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist part of the world. But when Chiang Kai-shek took power, one of the first things he did was to launch a so-called white terror to slaughter all the communists in China that were working with the Guomindang. And so in 1927, there was a big, huge massacre in Shanghai of members of the Chinese Communist Party. And so for many years, there was this civil war. That was the original civil war between the Guomindang and the Chinese and the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China called for a ceasefire and a united front to fight the Japanese who had invaded China, prior to the Second World War. I think it started in 1937, or even before that. And so there was a period of ceasefire between the Guomindang and the Communist Party of China. And after the Japanese were defeated in 1945, I think, despite efforts, by Zhou Enlai to try and negotiate between the Guomindang and the Communist Party, the civil war broke out again. And so, and it lasted to 1949, when the Communist Party was victorious and declared the People's Republic of China in 1949. And so when Chiang Kai-shek was defeated, he went over to Taiwan, where about 2 million people who were associated with the Guomindang. And he also stole a lot of Chinese historical artifacts to set up his museum in Taipei. And so that's how the situation of Taiwan developed. And Taiwan at that time was supported 1,000% by the Americans because they saw it as a fixed aircraft carrier to launch attacks against China at that time. And so today, that is being revived by the so-called Taiwan independence movement.
Interesting. It's very interesting to understand some of this history, because I think a lot of people, don't get this from watching the news and that kind of thing, and can very easily been sort of coaxed into thinking that China is a big threat and that we have to fight China and that kind of thing. So I think a little bit of education could go a long way in that sort of thing. Can you tell us why Canada should have good relations with China?
Yeah, first of all, you brought up this issue of the BYD. I think Canada should have good relations with China because you can buy a BYD electric vehicle for $11,500 US, which is a lot cheaper than a gas power vehicle. So that would be one of the benefits. But not just having a EV vehicle to drive, but it's also a question of what we can do together to fight climate change. Because the Chinese are the world leaders in battery technology, in EV manufacturing, solar cell manufacturing, and in renewable energy development. And so that would benefit a lot Canada's efforts to fight climate change. So I don't know what has happened, and you probably know this a lot more than I would, in terms of Canada's so-called Green Plan, because I see no indications of it. And if what's his name, the minister Guilbeault, I think his name, he went to China because China and Canada still have this environmental agreement. So people went to China as part of their routine meetings, and he was totally denounced by everybody, of dealing with the so-called China threat. How dare he speak to our enemy? As if everybody's considering China to be an enemy of Canada, which it isn't. But that mentality is there. So if we want to develop and fight climate change for the betterment of humanity, I think this is one of the reasons why we should have good relations with China. Apart from the day-to-day economic, social, and cultural benefits that we can reap, and these would be mutually beneficial benefits for both countries, Canada and for China.
Yeah, and I hear that China has made significant progress on environmental issues, like in terms of air pollution within cities, like having so many electric vehicles coming online. That apparently Beijing, that used to be known for very bad air quality, has made significant improvements in recent years. So, do you know much about that?
Yes, and I know something about it because I had to seek the information. You don't see it in the mainstream media, and nobody talks about it. China has done tremendous work in planting trees to desertify. Anyway, to plant trees in deserts, and they've planted now they plant trees in an area the size of Belgium, I believe, in the northwest province of Xinjiang. In China, they were able to plant. In Beijing, they were able to plant trees to cut down on the dust coming in, being blown in on a regular basis from the Gobi Desert. And and many of the factories that were in the outlying areas of Beijing, they have been shut down or moved somewhere else. So the air in Beijing, it's probably a lot better than it was. I remember first going to Beijing in 1970. Yes, in 1975. Yes, the air pollution was terrible. But then I was back there about 5 years ago, and the air was clear.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly the Chinese can make progress on certain issues like that when they set their mind to it. Things tend to happen pretty quickly. I was wondering if, in conclusion, we could get your perspective on what people in Canada and the Canadian government can do to, restore relationships with the People's Republic of China and with Chinese Canadian individuals here. There's this Bill C-70 that's going forward, and there's a political and media climate that is very unfavorable towards the democratic participation of Chinese Canadians. What do you think some of the main things that can be done to reverse this unfortunate trend?
Okay, I think the first thing for us in the Chinese Canadian community is to form unity amongst ourselves, because the media and the government have done a pretty good job in dividing the community. And now they're promoting a new model minority within the Chinese Canadian community, and these are the ones that have assimilated the Western ideology of Canadian democracy and the Canadian way of life under threat by China. And so these are the ones that get invited to testify at the House of Commons hearings on Chinese interference. They're the ones that get testify, and they gave prominent positions in the in pushing the public inquiry on foreign interference, and these are the ones that are quoted by the Global Mail and all the mainstream media. So this is a new moral minority, and so we need to be able to somehow neutralize their efforts, if not to try to isolate them. But the best thing is to unite, is to get them to unite with us to fight for the democratic rights of Chinese Canadians, because we see our rights being eroded. If you have a Chinese Canadian politician who do not share the mainstream narrative that China is a threat, then that person will be vilified in the media, and then you would have a knee-jerk reaction from Justin Trudeau saying, "Oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have him in our caucus," etc., etc. And so they've drawn their hand down out of the caucus, because he hasn't voiced anything about supporting China. But it's just that he did not come out to denounce China. And so, unlike that conservative guy, Michael Chong, which, by the way, could be our next foreign minister if the Poilievre gets elected. So that's the added danger of electing the conservatives and of the Chinese Canadian community. So we have to unite. We have to call for unity also with progressives and peace-loving people like yourselves to help the Chinese Canadian community to put forward our positions. And I'm in a small group of people or groups of people who are talking amongst ourselves as to how we can do this and what we should do. And I think one of the first fight back attempts is the Chinese Family Service lawsuit against RCMP, because RCMP has publicly called the CFS a Chinese police station, which in our eyes is defamation. It's just like the old days of McCarthyism. Have you ever been, or have you not, been a member of the Communist Party, or a fellow traveler, and so on. And so just by an illusion, they stigmatize, the Chinese Family Service. And right away, the Quebec government withdraws all the funding. And the funding was for French, to teach people French and how to integrate immigrants into the Quebec society. But I guess,
It's just insane. That file is just so insane that the government would, or the RCMP would point towards community centers and say, these are Chinese police stations, without advancing any proof, without any witnesses coming forward, without anything at least available to the public to substantiate these massive allegations. It's completely absurd. And I imagine that at some point they'll have to answer for it, because as you mentioned, there is the defamation suit. But to be able to go and vilify and to have concrete impacts, I know that like the bank had canceled the mortgage for the building that the Chinese Family Service was in, and the Quebec government pulling back the funding, as you mentioned. Like it's really incredible. And especially afterwards put out a statement saying that, well, now these Chinese police stations have been shut down. When meanwhile, who was arrested? What happened? Like, where are the search warrants? Like, I mean, the fact that they're not even able to execute a search warrant shows that they don't even have enough to convince a judge to issue it. So it seems like as if they're looking for something, and then to go and set up a kiosk and hand out things in Chinatown saying, well, if you've been intimidated by the Communist Party, please get in touch with us and stuff like that. It looks like they're fishing. It looks like they're trying to solicit as many complaints like this as possible to give some sort of a legitimacy to these, from my point of view, completely unsubstantiated attacks on Chinese community centers and Chinese community.
Well, it was intimidation, and it wasn't just a kiosk. It was a monster van. It was one of their huge, what they call mobile units, that was parked prominently on Saint Laurent Boulevard, in the heart of Chinatown. And then they sent out a whole group of agents, aided by the Montreal police and the Sûreté Québec, to go door to door. And they were trying to take advantage of the emergence fear of the situation in Chinatown, where there's been a lot of vandalism, theft, homelessness, and so on. And they say, well, if you feel afraid, just come and report it to us. They didn't even say, the Chinese Communist Party. They just say, if you feel afraid, you just report it to us. And so, because they want to jack up the numbers of fear within the community and jack up the numbers of people reporting to the RCMP and the police from Chinatown. And in talking to some of these merchants, they can see through this, this scheme by the RCMP, because naturally, they don't want to have anything to do with them.
Yeah. Listen, William, it's been very interesting getting your perspective on these different issues, and definitely the Green Party of Quebec stands against anti-Chinese racism and would like to see our government pursue a far more positive approach, both with the People's Republic of China and also with the Chinese Canadian community. I think that people have been unfairly targeted because of this Yellow Peril, as you've described it. And so we'll continue to follow these issues going forward. And I wish the best of luck to you in your activism and to the Chinese Canadian community in overcoming the continuation of some of this systemic racism.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your support. We really appreciate it.
Well, that concludes this week's episode of the Eco Mindset Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with William Dere. I thought that we got a really interesting perspective on some of the historical context with respect to some of the anti-Chinese racism that we're seeing in Canadian politics these days. Of course, at the Green Party of Quebec, we want to make sure that everybody's included, that everybody is able to exercise their democratic rights, and we want to push back against this wave of anti-Chinese racism in Quebec and Canadian politics. If you enjoy this episode, we're going to be having more in this series about anti-Chinese racism coming up in the following weeks. I invite you to like our page, leave us a comment with what you think, and of course, subscribe to the Eco Mindset Podcast on YouTube.